They know it. They want to see the good, bad, and the ugly, but they want it to be real. And they want you to sweat for it and not just say, this, I got this always works.
If you have ever seen a Deep Purple performance following, you may recall a quiet man from 1994. Positioned on the stage's far right, he didn't approach or say anything. The audience ignored the camera. However, when his fingers moved quickly and precisely and emotionally charged, you may have discovered, you may be asking yourself, who is this guy and why haven't I heard of him previously? Steve Morse is his name, and he's not a rock celebrity without any frills, noise, or controversies. However, he was recognized as the best guitarist in Guitar Player magazine's global ranking for only 3 titles in 5 consecutive years throughout history. People have helped compose 10,000 notes a day in practice. Music that combined jazz, rock, and classical and nation. Like a sound designer, at one point, he stood in front of a crowd crowded with folks who merely wanted to observe Ritchie Blackmore, and they began to question, amazed by his instrument by itself behind him. That stillness is the foundation of an unusual life. Decisions that cause a body to become more painful by the day, yet the music never stops. Heart that made the decision to leave the spotlight, not due to failure, but due to love, and if you believe you already possess all the necessary knowledge regarding a musician, continue to observe, because Steve Morse's story is only barely. Steve Morse's early years were born in Hamilton, Ohio, in 1954, but his childhood didn't happen all at once. Location: his family frequently relocated from Ohio to Tennessee, where they ultimately made their home in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Steve initially learned about music, but not via rock or like the majority of children his age. His father served as their home's traditional minister. The Rolling Stones and the Beatles did not exist. And obviously no Hicks, as there were church hymns, solemn, reverent tunes, songs that had a melancholy mood instead of resisting. Beautiful. Steve listened. And he enjoyed it, which may be why even individuals would detect a trace later in life. Bach and Morse's guitar performance, intricate, tranquil, and full of power. But Steve needed every child his own area, a personal haven of liberty. He concealed a transistor within his cranium, radio beneath his pillow, ensuring that each after the lights went out that night, he could listen to the prohibited sounds in secret. Soul, rock and roll, and reverberations from a universe that would never be accepted by his father. Steve started a band when he was a teenager. Played in church halls under the name 3 and parties in high school, but what made him, it was not his playing that stood out, but rather his long, wavy hair that is defiantly uncut despite the school's regulations, and that God he was expelled for one in the 10th grade. Just for the sake of not cutting his hair. But what appeared to be a conclusion actually opened. He finished 11th grade with a significantly larger door. In a Catholic school back then, was admitted straight to the University of the Music program in Miami without even it was there when I graduated from high school. That Steve got to know the individuals who would alter his life and that of Andy West Jacko, all students under Pastorius Pat Metheny. But these weren't your typical ones. They were musical aliens, including Steve Morse. The A-boy who played hymns and had been expelled and had a dream about Hicks stealthily entering the game without introduction and early professional experience. At the Steve Morse of the University of Miami wasn't pursuing the fame he sought. The type of truth that is musical appears when the norms and formulas of a genre are entirely disassembled in laboratories, demonstrations and workshops. He never gave up trying out different blends. Bach and jazz fusion with bluegrass with the mandolin and southern rock combination distortion, followed by his Andy West, a lifelong buddy, and his musical relationship they've had since high school. The band Dixie Dregs' very name alluded to its peculiarly masculine nature. Defiant and completely indefinable in a time when lyrics and singing were essential to music. Dixie Dregs's effortless attractiveness made her the opposing a band that has no vocalists at all, instrumental, in which every track developed as a trip of 6 to 7 minutes of technique and feeling without the need for choruses. No famous celebrities to look up to during sing-alongs, only sound unadulterated and unafraid when they signed with Capricorn Records. The Allmans' Home Free Fall, the brothers' debut album, when 1977 came out, hardly nobody purchased it, but according to critics Morse was recognized that away as a compositional mastery. Each of the 11 tracks was composed by him, and above all, he wrote to confront rather than to satisfy both the audience and himself. In their next What If album 1978 saw a noticeable shift, and there are also overtones of southern rock, more folk. It didn't chart for classical music, but the band received an invitation to play at the Montreux Jazz Festival as a tribute to any instrumental act, but the market was still intolerant of anything difficult. Dixie fell bankrupt after digesting Capricorn. Dregs were abandoned without a label guidance they agreed upon with Arista, and put out 3 additional albums, remnants of the standard for the Earth Unsung Heroes industry. However, every time they were forced to normalize Arista's desire for the group to alter their name, include lyrics, and include a Steve, the singer, nodded and kept writing as he had always done with diligence. In 1982, Standard released their last album of that was praised as their best guitar phase. Guitar Album of the Year. According to Player magazine, Steve Morse was chosen as the best that year. Guitar player in the world, beginning a 5-year rule that was untouchable in the community of professional guitarists. But the band behind that ascent was worn out by they broke up because of their ongoing miscommunication. Silently, without saying goodbye, and Steve, the man who just crowned the summit, Morse, an American guitarist, decided to vanish. Success in the workplace. Following Dixie Dregs, Steve Morse disbanded in the early 1980s. Avoided the slump that many musicians faces after technically peeing. Instead, he began a new chapter in his life. During the period of his career when music was not limited to laboratory tests, but rather directly conflicted with popular preference, and here, Morse started to disclose an uncommon present that appeared to revive bands depleted of vitality without losing his own identity. He joined in 1986. Kansas was a band that was well known for Dust in the Wind and Keep the Sun Moving Forward, but now having trouble speaking after the upheavals. Morse series did not arrive. Not as a rescuer, but just as a musician who composed and engaged in play with commitment. And that's exactly what helped Kansas break free from its creative rut. All I Wanted, a song co-written by Unexpectedly, Morse became the band's Billboard's final top 20 hits, a reminder that technique and emotion are not mutually exclusive. Each other out if positioned properly. Despite this, he only made 2 album appearances. Morse, Power and the Spirit of Things left a strong, subtle impression. However, the person who drew Kansas away from on the edge of that silent return, the basis for the most important choice of his career by joining Deep Purple in 1994, saw Ritchie Blackmore become a legend. Who was indispensable to many admirers there. Was not a more demanding role, but instead of attempting to emulate Blackmore, Morse decided to start over and rewrite. The statement from 1996 was perpendicular. Deep Purple was still alive, changing songs such as Sometimes I Feel, Ted, It's Like Screaming, Aviator Va-Voom. The Mechanic introduced a new, contemporary tone. Technique-rich but still grounded in the hard rock soul song by the band didn't suddenly, he merged in, and he raised throughout the following 28 years. Steve Morse would become the member with the longest tenure in the chronology of Deep Purple's appearance on 8 lots of live releases and studio albums, and investing over 20 years introducing the group to fresh generations of admirers. And above all, he succeeded. Without ever having to take center stage and paying close attention, he knew when to step aside to allow the music to take center stage. In between Deep Purple, Morse's tours never gave up on his vision of purity artistic expression, and thus, Flying 2011 saw the birth of Colors, which wasn't a business endeavor, but an assembly of reliable musicians Neil Morse and Mike Portnoy, musicians Dave LaRue and Casey McPherson. Steve thought Flying Colors were cool. A playground for thought where technical proficiency was used for describing how their debut album was received. The hard rock top 10 seconds on the Billboard Third Degree 2019 and Nature 2014 were hailed as flawless by critics. Prog rock and emotional marriages. Morse and melody, as usual, didn't require the center of attention. He was the glue, that the unseen foundation of everything from Kansas. Steve, you've gone from Deep Purple to Flying Colors. Morse has never adhered to a set pattern. Didn't meet expectations, he just and subtly transformed tired bands into newer iterations of oneself by nothing but commitment, accuracy, and humility. No cheers are required, simply the opportunity to be heard, and he managed to, even when they are unaware, people pay attention. His name means invisible sacrifices and pain when each note is accompanied by pain, and a career takes a back seat to love. For almost 30 years performing with Deep Purple, Steve Morse never demonstrated his hurting. The stance remained unchanged. Quiet, with a modest rightward tilt, his guitar dangling just below his shoulder, expressionless face. But behind each downstroke for each appears simple, a body screamed as the thread was pulled. Few people were aware of that for more than a decade. Steve had been quietly fighting serious deteriorating arthritis in his joints, hands, particularly the pinky and wrists. The cartilage in the ring fingers was eroding. Every night, I grind against bone ache. Discomfort when grasping objects, especially when he continued to play while doing nothing. Out of sheer will, not habit, he didn't voice any complaints or cancel any shows. Didn't seek pity. Instead, he silently altered everything to allow him to continue to live with his homemade guitar. Bespoke muting gadgets that have rediscovered how to grasp a reconstructed finger with a pick. Motions to release pressure on injured songs such as Too Many Notes. He even completely altered his method from using a finger-picking technique only to make undoubtedly every note was heard on stage. It's no longer only fun to play the guitar, he reportedly remarked. It's a war, but in April, the most intense suffering wasn't bodily. Janine Morse, his wife, received a diagnosis in 2022. With cancer, no news release, no tears on social fundraising campaigns. Steve and the media remained mute, and by July he formally stepped aside. That year departed Deep Purple at the end of 28 years, millions of fans, and 1,000 performances around the world. He didn't stop to rest. He departed to accomplish a few things in the rock world has ever done: pick the person he loves throughout the stage. I am unable to continue touring while the one love needs me. A brief sentence at most, but possibly his greatest life choice was to leave the lights behind the throng at a position that one could swap out. Steve Morse went back to his peaceful house, where he used to perform in Ocala, Florida, playing a guitar in a field where his spouse was receiving medical care, and where every day turned into a different kind of note. One of patience, love, and care that didn't require words, in a universe of rock where divorces following shattered love stories, tours, relationships were given up for stardom. Steve Morse took a different route, and he endured physical discomfort as he walked it out. Maybe caused his hands to move more slowly, but not did he briefly cease living as an artist, and if it meant giving up all the praise, he would do all for one enduring love. Once more, without hesitation, personal life offstage. Steve Morse doesn't lead a legendary life. He leads a typical life, thus modest enough that if you let him on you wouldn't likely guess he was played the guitar once for one of the best rock bands in history. Fancy clothing, no ostentatious vehicles, statements in the headlines. He lives on a tiny farm located in Ocala, Florida. Taking care of the garden is how mornings start. and guitars marked the conclusion of late afternoons. Noise is coming from a house that was built by itself. Janine, his wife, resides in the studio. Woman who was there for him before any fame and the primary cause of his departure from Deep Purple doesn't glance behind them. Talk extensively about one another in interviews. Their love is quite full, and has a deep quality similar to Morse's music. Without having to be shown, a few people are aware of that prior to going back to Steve's full-time job in music included a brief stint as late in the 1980s. A commercial pilot discovered wasn't a way to avoid music, but rather a pause and take a detour if needed to reset for him. Flying was emotionally similar to control was required when playing the guitar. Feeling and the capacity to look beyond the perspective that kept him there grounded, juggling life in the frequently turbulent, harsh music industry. Even years later, he kept flying without proof anything, but just because it felt similar to meditation, another method of knowing the world, albeit in private. Morse never lost contact with the neighborhood. He kept teaching little talks with students in class and writing educational materials and lent his guitar knowledge through charitable endeavors. He never considered himself a star, merely someone who somewhat followed the way earlier and was prepared to remain in place. To encourage people who follow him, he never used music as a self-help aid. He believed that music was a means of life and exist independently of now. A note or tune would seem hollow. In his 70s, although many of his contemporaries have retired. Steve, are you removed from the spotlight? Morse keeps up his covert creations not to gain more notoriety for financial gain, yet because he is unable to produce, just like though he is unable to quit loving and caring for and clinging to the important things. Most music in recent years has been peaceful and homely. Steve has been with Deep Purple since 2022. Morse hasn't performed on large platforms or went on exhausting global tours, but if you would be wrong to believe that he is retired. Actually, Morse has never been this busy. Freely.